Good morning. My name is Gustavo Tumialan. I am with the Boston office of Simpson, Gumpertz, and Heger. Transitional masonry facades are a type of construction that is very common in many cities of the United States. And the deterioration of the structural frame can cause a hazard of the masonry. So the topic of this presentation, even though it's masonry, the intent is to show that the deterioration of the underlying conditions, underlying frame, which could be steel or concrete, can cause a real hazard when the masonry deteriorates. This is our agenda for today. Given that the topic is wide, we have divided this presentation in two parts. The first part, I'm going to be giving this presentation, is going to be on the problem. I'm going to provide a background on transitional masonry, how transitional masonry buildings, facades deteriorate, and what are the hazards that masonry can cause. In the afternoon, Greg Cohen, from my office too, he will be presenting part two, which would be the solution to the problem. How we inspect, how we assess transitional masonry, and most importantly, how we repair and mitigate the deterioration. So just to give you background on masonry construction, actually masonry facade construction in the United States, mass masonry is the oldest masonry in the United States. It was common before the 1890s. Is what you see, these very thick walls, multi-wide walls with thicknesses that vary from 12 inches to 30 inches typically, although you can find thicker walls. It was constructed until the 1933 in the western United States, until the Long Beach earthquake, which caused a lot of damage to unreinforced masonry. And it was constructed until the 1950s in the eastern United States. Transitional masonry, it was common in the early 1900s until the 1940s. Transitional masonry is a hybrid masonry. It's a hybrid type of construction, which consists of a structural frame, which could be constructed with steel or concrete, and masonry. Then we have the contemporary masonry. Contemporary masonry is more from the late 1940s, and this is where we can have the typical barrier wall or cavity walls that you see in the facades. This photo shows a construction of the transitional masonry. It's an old photo. It's a type of construction, as I said, that's typical in many cities of the United States. And it's called transitional because it's a period of time, corresponds to a period of time where the building construction was transitioning from the mass masonry to the skeleton frames that we know now. The reason they were changing is because it was the desire of construct taller buildings, and mass masonry was not practical and efficient any longer, and people started to think about other systems, and that's why they still keeping the masonry using structural steel frame. And as I said, the masonry is a hybrid system, transitional masonry, which consists of the structural frame, which could be of a reinforced concrete or steel. We are allowed to talk about steel structures, I guess. Yes. And masonry facade, which consists of an inner white and an outer white, which is more clear here. This is a photo from an old detail from a building. And you can see here, in this case, a steel beam, which could be a concrete beam, supporting a concrete floor. The steel beam, which is a structure, supporting an inner wall or backup wall, which in this case is constructed with clay tiles. That was typically constructed with clay tiles. And the exterior is an outer wall constructed of a brick, which many times extends from the top to the ground. It's not intermediately supported. So the design and construction of this type of transitional masonry have or had two features that can lead to deterioration. The first, the lack of detailing to accommodate movement, lack of expansion. And the second one, which is probably the main reason of the deterioration, is that fully relied on the masonry to prevent water ingress to the building, to the interior of the building. This is a schematics of what a transitional masonry or transitional masonry facade is. See the structural frame, and then the masonry, which basically is encasing all the structural frame. These are two photos, two examples of two buildings, which you can find in many places. Many of these buildings are historic, so they need to be restored, and it's another, with the subject of this session, which has to do with mitigate the hazard. The other aspect was preservation. So it's important sometimes to preserve these buildings because of the historic significance to the cities. Here we can see the structural frame. Just as an example, it's an opening. Here you see an opening in the building, in the brick facade, and the frame. In this case, steel frame. Just to give you an example. Now, how do transitional masonry facades deteriorate? Masonry walls exposed to weather are going to collect the rainwater, are going to become reservoirs. And the transitional masonry design and construction does not have features to isolate or protect the steel frame. So therefore, the steel frame or the concrete frame are prone to deterioration. And the deterioration of the frame eventually leads to deterioration of the adjacent masonry, which is encasing the frame. What happens is it causes two problems. The first problem, it may be a structural problem because the structural frame is being deteriorated, so that can compromise the structural capacities, the ability to carry gravity loads, for instance, of columns or beams. And the second problem is because as the interior or the underlying concrete elements deteriorate, expand. The rust on the steel beams can expand and push out the masonry. Same thing happens with the concrete. Concrete delaminates and spalls and eventually can crack the masonry, and that masonry can become a real fault hazard. So what we see here is several, a few examples of underlying deterioration, signs of something may be happening to the structural frame. These are columns where you can see, where you don't see the columns here, but it's a location of a column where you see vertical cracks extending along the entire height of the building. And that's an indication that probably corrosion is happening or damage is happening in the structural frame. Another example is a bulging of masonry. As the structural elements deteriorate, they're going to start to expand and push out the masonry. And then you can see here bulging or some out-of-place movement as shown in this photo, when the masonry can really become a fault hazard. This photo shows damage to other elements which are not really related to the damage of the frame, but can be related to damage of the lack of detailing to accommodate movement or exposure to the environment. For instance, in this case, you can see this is a cast stone window frame. You can see deterioration of the cast stone or movement of some of the ornamental elements. So those are not related directly to the deterioration of the frame, but it's due to the exposure of the entire facade. So what happens when you open this and you try to explore, understand why it's causing this? Well, this photo shows the deterioration of columns at different stages. First, you see here the deterioration, the initial cracks at the reinforcement, indicating that the reinforcement is corroding and expanding. Then you see the spalls and the lamination, and this, as they deteriorate, starts pushing out the masonry, and then first causing cracks, and then the masonry eventually can become loose and become a fall hazard. Same situation with steel frame. You can see here the rust on the steel column that has been pushing out the masonry, or in this case, a beam. Another case here, this is a case of a steel beam, in this case. You can see here, this arrow shows a hole in the beam, which has completely rotten out because of the deterioration, and this has caused a masonry to fail, really. It's pushing out, and the masonry falls. So, these damaged facade elements are a risk for public safety. I mean, this photo shows a collapse, of a partial collapse of a brick facade due to the deterioration of the structural frame. So they become real hazard because it can result in property damage, but what is worse, it could result in injuries or be fatal to public, to people. So the potential for fall hazard can be mitigated through periodic inspections and timely repairs. And that's the intent of the facade inspection ordinance, which I'm going to refer shortly after this. So I'm not sure if there are statistics or a number of times that pieces of brick have fallen on the street. But it's not uncommon to see news about bricks falling. I mean, this is just an example of a news showing how a piece of brick fall on the facade and they cause damage, or even, which is worse, hurt people. So, in response to this risk of a piece of facade falling to people, the cities have enacted what is called the facade inspection ordinances. The purpose of these ordinances is to ensure the public safety by performing periodic inspections and the facade components and identify early fall hazards. Currently, I believe there are 13 cities in the United States that have a facade ordinance. Boston is one of them. The oldest is New York City. I believe it was enacted in the early 1980s as a result of an accident. In Boston, it was enacted in 1995, is my understanding. So these ordinances require the building owners to have their facades inspected in cycles. It's typically every 5 years. And the requirements vary. Every city has its own requirements. But typically, it depends on the height of the building. It requires a minimum hands-on inspection. Really, you have to touch some of the areas to assess closely. And also, it depends on the locations of the walls, if they are front walls or back walls, depending on the city. So the classification is simple. Is the engineers, we are responsible for preparing a report, which has to say if the structure or the facade is safe with repairs and maintenance program, or is unsafe. In that case, the owner has to repair the facade. I'm not going to go into detail this, but if you're interested, there are some standards that can be used for the inspection of, in general, facades, not necessarily transitional masonry. This is a good one published by the ICRI, which is specific to evaluation of masonry facade structures. There are also ASTMs that are both useful for to perform inspections. So this is the end of the part one. As I said, the purpose of this section was to provide a background on the deterioration of transitional masonry facades. In the second part, this afternoon, Greg Cohen is going to be presenting about the inspection methods and the repair and protection strategies for these kind of facades. So just before I finalize, a couple of takeaways. Transitional masonry facades deteriorate due to the corrosion damage of the structural frame. Could be concrete frame, could be steel frame. The deterioration of the frame can compromise structural capacities, the ability of the frame to carry the design loads or the gravity loads. The masonry deterioration, which is a resulting from the deterioration of the structural frame, can cause fault hazards. And then the transitional masonry facades require periodic inspections and timely repairs, and that's why some cities have a facade ordinance.